discuss kind of where are we making progress with all the research. And it was great having Wendy would talk about this at the keynote right at the beginning, because she was talking about the research and where we need to go. And so it's gonna, some of the things that I'll be saying this morning are gonna be similar to what she spoke about the first day, yesterday. So I just want to kind of go through this. I handed you a reference list, and this is not inclusive of all. In fact, when I went back and looked up, I'm like, oh, I forgot Wendy's work on there too as well. So that was not a good. So you can. One. I know, but you can just put some more in there. So yes. So I apologize. For that. But this is not an inclusive list at all. And so I put together just a timeline that I will show in just a second, and just we're looking for different milestones as we transition in our research focus from basic observations to eventually where we're going, and looking at how do we determine whether we're making progress, because some of the criteria that we look for in perhaps other disciplines may have different types of criteria saying we're making success, while we might look at it differently. So how do we gauge progress? We can look at the how, the what, and the why. And actually I'll kind of combine the what and the why in a second. But we have to look at, first of all, how we do research. And you saw this exact same thing. Have you seen it probably in a couple, I believe the epidemiology presentation yesterday, Kimberly also talked about this. So one of the things that we look at when we look at research is how is it done? So are we making progress by the types of research that is starting to be published about a certain topic? So it all starts with the very beginning part, which is people's opinions and ideas and what we're seeing. And this is where the industry, if you will, if you want to call it an industry of equine-assisted services started, was really from practitioners, you all in the arena saying, this is what we're seeing, this is why our clients are coming. Some of the early work really came out of the UK and with the Hippo therapy, but there wasn't a lot on this other frontier when we started adding the psychotherapy part of it, different populations that all started to come earlier. So we find that a lot of the information people were reporting was anecdotal, and that you see it on the websites, and people were saying this is a great program, it's having these benefits, but there were no numbers behind that. But that's a great place to start. And so I always, when I'm doing my research, the first thing I do is if I'm going to be working with facilities, I say, well, tell me what you're seeing. Tell me what the people are saying. Because I listen very carefully for some key words. And then I think about that can become a variable in which we're going to actually explore a little bit deeper. So we have to look at this. So this is a very important part that we don't want to overlook and say it's not important in research, because it's where research starts. But then we can also start to develop case reports and case studies. And as it moves up, you'll hear a lot about randomized controlled trials being the gold standard. And while that is a gold standard in medical research, it becomes a little bit more difficult to say it's the gold standard in more practical application. Because while it looks really great on paper, and it looks really nice in a nice design protocol and a proposal, it doesn't always work so well in the field. And so I'm in public health, so we do a lot of community-based interventions. And we have to do evidence-based, and so we do the same kind of research. But we find out that it's not always easy to do randomized clinical trials in a community setting when we're talking about behavioral change. And in a way, we're talking about behavioral change in your work that you're doing here. So while that is a gold standard, I think we have to be very careful saying that if it's not a randomized controlled trial design, then it's not a worthy design. Therefore, it's not adding to that growing body of empirical data that we need to have to support the industry. And so you can branch off that, have quasi-experimental. There's some other ones that could be actually richer in the data and still have very significant impact on the viability and the reliability of the data. So I think we have to be very careful and not thinking that if it's not randomized control, that it's not worthy of doing. Great when you can do it, but not always practical. And if it's still a strong research design, even a very strong case series design, especially when we're dealing with participants that have a lot of variability, like children with autism, that they almost need to be their own control group. And there's ways of designing the research so that it's very strong research design that will have statistical power in that data that we get out the other end of it. So if it's designed well, it'll still be very effective. And then, but once you've got a lot of the research starting to be published, then you have an opportunity to do a systematic review. And that's what Wendy was doing in her work, that the systematic review is you start to look across different research out there, and there's ways of systematically looking at it and then determining which ones fit certain criteria, where are our gaps, where are our strengths. The next step up to that is a meta-analysis, and that takes a while. You can't really do a good, strong meta-analysis looking at effect sizes, which means how effective is an actual intervention, until you have consistency across interventions and also enough of the published research in the literature to be able to do a very strong meta-analysis. So that's kind of a top one that takes a while. And I'm going to talk about one of the issues that we're seeing that's going to probably delay that a little bit, and is part with the different interventions that we're looking at. So if you look at the quality of information, it considers traditionally that the further up you go, the higher the quality, the more evidence out there for either support or not support for a type of intervention or whatever it is that we're looking at. So that's kind of the how. Then the what. So, and I'm going to explain in a second, we'll look at the timeline here in a second. So the other way we're going to look at is, what are we studying? And one of the things I think we need to focus on is the mechanism of change. We're starting to see a little bit in that, but this is a very difficult thing. Understanding the critical components of equine-assisted services. So I have these four pictures up there, and every single one represents a different protocol and a different intention, and that's hard. So if you're looking at the only common denominator in there is people and a horse. But from a research perspective, how do I compare those? How do I actually design a research project that will be able to tease out what part of those four pictures is the critical component? And I know we want to gravitate, it's the horse, it's the horse. It may not, I love my horse, I love horses, but it may not be the horse be the critical component. It may be how we utilize the horse. And I know that's stepping on, we partner, that's one of the problems in research, is how we term that horse. Are we partnering with it? Are we using it as a tool? I know it's a bad thing, but that's hard for researchers, because to say that we're partnering with a methodology is very difficult to actually describe in the literature. And it's one of the big stumbling blocks that we've had in research, is how do we define this four-legged animal that's part of this bigger picture? And so when we look at this, we have to say, what are the critical components? What is the mechanism of change? What is the thing that is causing or seems to be influencing the outcome? Because the causative part is very difficult. It's more of a correlation at this point. So you see you've got up on the left-hand side there, a little boy, and he's obviously, Mike, if you had to guess, you probably have an OT or a PT person working with that person. So now I have that therapy that's part of that. The one in the center, we might have a mental health expert working in that area. Over on the right, might not be any OT, PT, or mental health person in that. There may be. And then on the bottom, we just have the horse and the person. There's nobody else sitting there. So out of those, which one was the most key component? We don't know. We have no idea at this point. In all of the research that we're looking at, we have some suggestions. We have some studies that seem to be pointing us in certain directions, but we really don't know the mechanism of change. What is the key components? Because all of the different protocols are different. So if we look at what and why, so then we can look at thinking about the variables, the theories, and the variables that are behind all this. And so why do we need to think about theory? We need to look at, in the research, are there any theories that are starting to surface? And when I speak of theories, it's not just the theory of change, which is connected to the mechanism of change. So why is this occurring? But also going back and looking at theories of behavior change. in the world of psychology and in public health and sociology and social work, we use a lot of theories to describe why is somebody doing something. And so we know if we can influence certain components, then we hopefully have a different outcome in the behavior. And we're really talking about behavior in a lot of ways. Yes, we're talking about physical changes, physiological changes as well, but behavior is also part of it. We want people to engage in life more. We want people to communicate better. We want people to be able to socialize. Those are behaviors that we're looking at. So we need to think about when we're doing some of the research and looking at some of the research, are there any theories that this is anchored to, that they've anchored this study to a theory? And I tell my students all the time, you need to anchor to a theory because you're trying to show what are the critical components in this particular intervention that are having an influence. What are we influencing? For instance, just to kind of pull from a public health one, we use the health belief model a lot. And some of you know that, and right now with COVID, it's a great model to be using, because one of the things that model posits is that if you increase somebody's perceived susceptibility and perceived severity of the illness, they'll be more apt to actually engage in a preventative behavior. So we increase that this is really real, you can be affected by it, therefore you need to engage in the behavior. So having those kind of information really helps us when we design studies, that we think about what theories this might be working on, what is actually occurring in this interaction with the horse, that we could actually validate by using a theory as an anchor or as a framework. That can become very important and add, I don't want to use the word power, but add kind of power to the data that we're actually presenting. So some of the variables that we'll see that we measure on these research studies are things such as depression, and we're seeing brain function now with the MRI study, and we're doing an EEG study with children with autism right now. So we're starting to do some physiological changes, looking for those. Anxiety, heart rate variability, which we just had a presentation on. Stride, how the person's moving, we can actually measure all of that. Their confidence, their communication, post-traumatic stress, and those symptoms that go along with that. Their strength, their physiological strength, their autonomy, their ability to make choices for themselves. These are just some of the variables that we can look at in the research. And so one of the things you see is there's a lot, we could just expand this 3 or 4 slides. And while that's exciting, it also makes it a little bit more difficult from a research perspective to figure out what is it that we're really doing? What is it that what kind of impact does it have? So I put together a timeline, and this is part of it, there's another sheet. So I wanted to go back and think about those, go back again, and let me just go back to these. So you want to look at the how. So how are the studies being done? We want to look at, is anything talking about mechanism of change? Are they trying to tease out anything about what is actually occurring, what needs to be part of it? And then also looking for studies that have started to integrate theories and what variables that they're actually measuring in that. So this is not inclusive, and I apologize if your particular study is not up here. It's not to exclude anybody. I was just looking for some changes over time. So if I go all the way back to 2008, and that's kind of where I came into the picture, 2006 and 2008 as a researcher. That's when I started coming into this field, looking about what has been done with horses. And I found nothing other than some hippotherapy articles coming from the UK and some of the other ones. There was a few out there, but there was definitely nothing with veterans. There was nothing in the literature. And so we're starting from very, very beginning, some observational studies, just people examining and watching, and there's some really good qualitative studies that could be done with observation. But remember, that was at the very bottom of the evidence pile there. So yes, observation and moving from anecdotal to actually using strong methodology and qualitative designs in research to now take that observations and bring it up into evidence-based, publishable research is important, and that's what started to emerge. So we started to see some of that coming, so we're starting to build up. Then we had some, and a lot of people refer back to the BAS studies, one of the early studies using with children with autism. So we started seeing some changes there. And one thing I want you to pay attention to is the little acronyms of what the heck we're calling the actual intervention. It's the word of the day, and I'm so thankful that we're finally starting to get some terminology, and I'm hoping that's going to help, because this has been really messy from a researcher's perspective, going, what do I call this today? I don't know, because it's going to go to print, which is usually 6 to 12 months after your study is concluded, and then it's going to sit in there and it's going to be published, and then people are going to refer back to it, and they're going to do the systematic review and go, what the heck was this person doing? Because we don't call it therapeutic writing anymore, we call it this or that. So that terminology was all over the place. But if we look about in 2009, we had it was an experimental study, so we're moving up the ladder a little bit, so that's a good direction. They noticed that it was an option in treating children with autism disorder or autism spectrum disorder. Then we had actually a clinical trial in 2012 that looked at Hippo therapy, again a different type of modality, different methodology being used with the horse involved, but treating children with movement disorder. So that started picking up, and we actually see more studies in movement out there than we do with some of the other areas. And then I did a study an experimental study with equine-assisted activities, and that time we did not have we used a center, and we didn't have a speech pathologist there. There was not a speech therapist or an OT or PT. They were doing equine-assisted activities, and again, so the treatment seemed to be, or the intervention seemed to be helpful. Then Gabriel's came out, and this was a big jump to 2015, and she came out with her study that she had gotten funding for, and that was a big start. And I actually talked to Robin about that, how she got the funding and those types of things. And she did an excellent job, and we just talked about how she's moving this forward. So that was a very important marker, because the funding behind there, and I could go a long time talking about NIH. NIH is extremely fickle, in the world of a lot of different areas, especially in this, but she was able to at least kind of get that started, and the funding part was important because now it's being recognized a little bit more. And of course, the Horses and Humans Research Foundation was also pivotal in getting this, because funding has been one of the biggest stumbling blocks we've had to getting the good data into the literature and getting the research conducted. So that was a big step, because that was a randomized controlled trial, so that RCT, which was good. She was able to do that. She did the barn activity versus the actual intervention. Then we came up and we had another experimental study that was also done in 2016, so starting to build on that. And one of the things I want you to start to notice is the population that we're building some of the more robust research around was children with autism. And so it's a good thing that we're leading with different types of populations. So I want to say right now in the research that they're leading. Those working with autism, the studies that have been conducted are stronger than some of the other conducted studies, and so they're kind of leading in this area. And that's okay, because it's still getting information out there. So then in 2017, that was my veteran, actually I had another veteran study before that was more of observational. And then I had a quasi-experimental study that was funded by Horses and Humans Research Foundation. And I started looking at how does that map to the International Classification of Functioning using, because we had OT involved in this, as well as how does that map, starting to anchor it to some kind of a framework, what components, starting to think about where are we making the biggest difference in disability, the physical or the functioning. One of the things that came from that was looking at how the environment actually has a factor in that. And then we had another replicated of a randomized control, which is a good thing to start replicating. The study should be well enough designed and described that another researcher could take that idea and replicate it. That's a good thing. You want to see, does it happen the same way in another setting, and another setting? So you want to know if that's a good thing to start to happen. That's why we have to describe our protocol very clearly, and what does our curriculum, if you want to call it curriculum, or the actual protocol we're using, what are we doing so somebody can replicate that? Because just saying we're doing equine-assisted activities or we're doing equine-assisted services, nobody really knows what that means when you're reading that and trying to replicate. And so that we're starting to move forward. You start to see some changes. If you think about that pyramid, we're starting to move up that pyramid. Then we had another randomized waitlist control that Rebecca Johnson did, also with funding from the Horses and Human Research Foundation. So that was another, so the veterans are starting to come into the picture a little bit more now. We're starting to see some increase there. And then I did a second publication on that study. And then we see some systematic mapping reviews. So remember going up that pyramid, and then also Dr. Wood also did systematic review with her. So we start to see those start to come in there. So now we have enough evidence in the literature that you could start doing the systematic review. You notice that there's no meta-analysis yet because we are far from that. We are a ways from getting to that because we need to still build that. So then we all start seeing a couple of other things. Start to see some qualitative studies that are popping up. Then we have the exploratory study with MRI. So we're starting to see, as you move this direction, we're starting to see where people are starting to tease out a little bit of the mechanism. What is actually occurring, and also moving from just behavioral assessments to physiological assessments. That's another important step, I believe, in this research, is being able to move from just physiological or just a behavioral assessment, self-assessments, to either using proxy forms, which is also helpful, somebody else observing that person, making observation, but then also backing it up with physiological changes. Because people will talk about it. So things such as the heart rate variability, mapping the MRI is phenomenal. We're doing some EEG work with children with autism right now as they're undergoing using mechanical horse, because we're actually taking that mechanism of change, and we want to see how much is the movement of the horse, how much of the movement, how much of that movement is part of the intervention. Do you have to have just the movement, or do you need the live animal? And I know we all want the live animal. I would rather have the live animal. But the positive thing is, not everybody can get to the live animal. So can they benefit from the movement if it's replicated as a horse? It's not a core trainer. And it's been actually developed using horses, and it works. And we know, because people are having the PT offices and OT, and down there at Rock has it, and they're like, this is great. Well, we've got to study it better. I did a study, it just got published, it was a while back, took a while for it to get through all of the study, but I published it. We looked at the mechanical horse versus the real horse to see changes it was a crossover trial. So we were able to see was there any major changes in motor coordination, and we used the bot test and some of the others that had an OT that actually did this testing, and we didn't see differences between the mechanical horse and the real horse, which is a good thing. In this case, I did not want to see differences, so that was a good thing. We saw some behavioral. The 3 out of the 4 kids preferred the real horse. 1 did not. He liked the mechanical horse, but he was also the child who took apart their sprinkler system and took apart the mom's radios and all sorts of stuff, because he was just loved that stuff. But he preferred the mechanical horse versus the other. But the good thing is we found out this could be efficacious for this particular population using a mechanical horse. Organic movement is what we call it. So we're actually testing that now, but we're adding those physiological changes. The brain, we're looking at stride, we're looking at balance, and I've got some preliminary data. If we have time, I can show you some of that. But what's important about that is not only what we're doing, but what other people are doing now. They're starting to bring the physiological changes and be able to monitor those, because that helps to support the behavioral changes as well, and figuring out how those things map. So that just strengthens the research when we start looking at those things that are not as subjective and more objective. Because when and if you're doing any of these kinds of research, I would also suggest pairing yourself with other professionals who are outside of your area. For instance, if I was my group, I'm working with people who have no idea about a horse. I'm working with biomechanic professional people who work, and that's their discipline. I'm working with those with cognitive that work with the EEG from the communication disorder department. If you're working with heart rates and those kinds of things, I would work with the exercise physiologist department to get their impact, because you're starting to bring other disciplines in that come from a different view and that can help you really translate that data better. And so that multidisciplinary team also helps to strengthen when you actually submit for publication. So looking beyond just those that have a vested interest in how improving the horse is helpful. Because it's what we want. I mean, our bottom line, I think we all want the horse to be helpful. We all think that way. But we can't let our emotions and our biases dictate what those outcomes will be and how we present them. We have to present from a very non-biased perspective and looking at what does the data tell us. So if we compare what's going on and we think about this timeline and we think about the how, the why, and the what, we are making some progress, I would say, pretty well in the design, the research design. We're making progress. We've got a long way to go, but we're moving the right direction across all different populations. Faster in some populations than in others. Where we're lagging is we look at all this, we're still in the outcomes. We're still in those variable outcomes, but we are not looking a lot about the mechanism of change. We're lagging behind in really being able to define what is occurring in that session and what are the important parts that we're overlooking. We've got to look beyond the horse. The horse is helpful, but what part of the horse is the most helpful? And is it the environment? With our veterans, those that work with veterans know how important it is to have another veteran in that place. Do we need a mental health person with the veteran? We don't know. And I'm going to tell you, I love mental health. I've gone to counseling myself. I think I advocate hugely for public health. But the data right now with veteran studies does not support having a mental health person there over not having a mental health person there. We don't know. In my study was 5 different centers. We did not have a mental health person involved. The study that was reported yesterday, they did. You know what? The outcomes were almost identical. We didn't have an MRI, but we had we were able to document a 13-point drop in PTSD symptoms by the PCL-5, and also we're able to show a drop in depression. It's the same as they did. I had 89 people, and I had a comparison group. So the outcomes were very similar, but we don't know. Those two things, it'd be great. We need to compare those. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I was just going to say, maybe not for the outcome, but for safety reasons, it could be required.
We had one
that
yes, if they had to, like, we didn't have them in there, they weren't processing, because that's the way the veterans would say, don't process me. That's what they would say to us when they come in. And they would ask, am I going to have to meet with a psychologist? And because at my particular, they didn't want to come for this particular one. But we had in the facility, because these were PATH accredited facilities, they had a mental health person that we could refer to, or this person was already seeing a mental health person outside of it. It just wasn't part of the protocol. So yeah, we would never ever do it, because some had to, if they did, they were referred. So we had people trained in that area, but it wasn't part of the protocol. And that's what we haven't teased that out. We don't, again, the mechanism changed. I think, I think mental health is very, very helpful. I don't know if we absolutely need it in the arena. We don't know that. If we look at just straight the data doesn't tell us either, because we've never compared it. The next thing would be phenomenal, would be a randomized controlled trial looking at several arms, one in the manual, because we had a manual as well. We had a curriculum that was laid out very nicely, and then they also have a curriculum, which is just, let's compare it. Those two compare, and then also compare it to another, and then a control. So you could do a 4-arm randomized controlled trial. It would be phenomenal. But that again goes back to that mechanism change. What is it that is the most critical component? And it's going to vary for the different populations that we're working with. And that's the hardest thing, is your populations are so different. And we don't know. The data there's not enough data out there in comparisons to know. And I think I heard somebody talking about I'm looking for it. I don't think she's in the session, but she was doing a study and the heart rate variability, and she's looking, I think they were actually using the horses, but then they're also using another recreation type of an activity, and that's a good thing too, to see if there's a difference between them. Is it the horse, or is it maybe the activity that is the thing? So, the timeline. Where are we going from this? And so again, we're using the mechanical horse, trying to parse out the movement. Opportunities to do that are to parse out a certain part of the intervention. We don't know dose. We don't know, in process evaluation, we call it dose delivered and dose received. we have no idea the dose that we need, which means how many sessions do we need? Does that session need to be twice a week? Does it need to be once a week? Because protocols are really different. And so we're far from that. That's another part, just like when you dose on vaccines. Do we need the booster? Do we not need the booster? Do we need 4 boosters? I don't know. We're trying to figure that out within these interventions. Do we need a booster? Do we need 5 sessions? We have no idea. So parsing those things out. The MRI study, I think, matching any kind of physiological changes, brain changes that we can monitor and that we can look at. So those are really important. So we've made some good progress in certain areas, but we've got a long way to go as well. So what are we doing well and what do we need to consider? This is what I was talking about. So progress, we've moved from observation to clinical trials. We've got some of those in there. Those are helpful. We don't always have to go to clinical trials. We just need strong research design. And if you don't, when we're putting projects together, and research design, let me tell you, is different. Different people have specialties in different research design. Even in academia, we have all different people some people are very good at case control studies, and that's what they know how to do. Partner with people who understand research design. Partner with statisticians that are specialized. And statisticians are very siloed, by the way. I'm finding out more and more. We have a department of statistics, and I know some statistics, but then I'll bring data and I'll say, what do you think? And they go, oh, that needs to go to the Bayesian people. I'm like, okay, we'll do the Bayesian people. So, so they're like, they petition it out, but they know that's their specialty. So make sure that in your studies need to have, or your protocols need to have a statistician that specializes in the type of design, and they help you on the front end to make sure the design is tight. Without a strong design, a research design, your outcomes don't mean anything. They could be anything. They have to have a strong design. So it doesn't have to move to clinical trials. It doesn't always have to be a clinical trial. Your design just has to be strong, and make sure that that you've had the right people looking at it. Publish systematic reviews, those are good. Continue with some, as we get more data, we'll have to, more studies out there, you have to redo those. We're a ways from the meta-analysis, but we're moving in the right direction. Include physiological variables, we've made some progress there. We're starting to see those pop up. Those are good. Again, make sure that other people who are in different disciplines, who work in those areas of physiological changes, make sure they're at the table, they're part of the research team. We can't be experts in all things, so you go to those experts if that's their expertise, whether it's an exercise physiologist or it's somebody who specializes in functional MRIs and neurologist and those kinds of things in neuroscience. You need to go to those because that's their specialty, and they bring that expertise in. Include physiological variables. You introduce some theories. Not only the theory of the mechanism of change, which needs to be clearly designed in there, but also using other theories, other accepted, well-published theories that's happening in other types of disciplines, in psychology and mental health and some of those other ones in there, making sure that you're starting to use some of those theories, you understand them, and you can actually measure the constructs to see if those actually make a difference. And then improve the funding. We've talked a lot about that. These studies take money. We talked about the issues, I talked about it yesterday, the constraints that are on the faculty members, that what we can and can't do. And it just takes adequate funding to be able to get a good, strong research. So neat things to consider: that mechanism change, collaborative, large-scale clinical trials or quasi-clinical trials, those types of things. Anything large-scale helps. Theory-based research, stronger methodology. That's really important. I just can't stress the design is so critical. Because we can't make jumps. Well, I think this is happening when we haven't looked at mediating and moderating variables and some of those other things that we just have to pay attention to, because we're claiming things that may or may not be relevant. And what happens is that other people look at the research and they go, oh, that doesn't make any sense and that's not strong. And so then we lose credibility. It's not helpful to publish a study that does not have a strong research design, because when you do it on the flip end, you do the review, the systematic review and meta-analysis, those don't get included. They get excluded. Off they go, and then we find out there wasn't a lot there to look at. After we looked at all the ones that have been published, there's only a few that hold up. And that's critical, that we're putting good information out there. Replication and expansion. Reading the studies that people have done, where are the gaps and how to fill in those gaps, or replicating a study that's been done but do it in a different setting, to see if the setting is making a difference. So if something is reliable, if that data is reliable, it should be repeatable. We should be able to repeat the exact same thing in a similar situation, come out with the same results or very close. That's a replication. That's not a bad thing. They do that all the time in real clinical trials of pharmacological drugs, and they do that over and over again. What happens in this population? What happens in this population? Is the drug as effective in the various populations? We're asking, is this intervention as effective in the different populations? And we don't know that. So, I know my time she's giving me the door, so I want to stop there. So thank you, and I open it up for questions. I gave you a reference list. I'll be happy to send you the electronic one. If you email me, I can send that to you if you go, you want that electronic. Yes.
So, this has just been great. Thank you, all of you researchers. Thank you so much. But when I noticed yesterday the census of who was in the room, there were a lot of practitioners. And so for the practitions who don't have access to funding for research, like what's the, and we have to go out and raise money for our programs. So how do we use this research? Like what do we say in our presentation to, I don't know, some sort of community program that says, look, there's research out there. This is who we want to serve. How do we take the research to support what we want to say to people?
Great question. And I know there was one presentation on how to read these the literature, because the research articles are not easy to figure out. It's like, what the heck are they talking about? So I would, if you have a partner, an academic partner, that's used to reading a lot of these, they can help to give the information. But what I suggest is, we do this a lot in public health, is we make infographics. Infographic is basically what you see a lot of times in your healthcare manuals when you're getting ready to do your healthcare insurance. You look at your health insurance and they have a little picture and they have little percentages, and it's very usable. You can take this information, and we do this a lot in public health. This literature is for other researchers to read, and it's really, unless you like to read this stuff, it's awful to read. I mean, it really is. It's just like, that's printed for other researchers and to use that. But what's helpful for community members is to make an infographic out of it. And so we can make an infographic. You can, again, if you wanted to collaborate with somebody in academics, they could do that. We teach that in my public health, because we try and make the information usable. I mean, what good's the information if it's not usable, to give back to our community partners? So we convert these to infographics. There's some simple software out there that you can actually use for free. So if you look under infographics, you can make your own. So I would do a very simple, maybe looking at some of the studies and then making an infographic that is easy and digestible for your funders. Because it's really, I think this was mentioned yesterday in one of the sessions too, about selling it, and it's a story. And what helps you get donations to your center, the data is great, but it's the stories that are behind the data, or that are, I say, in front of the data. It's the story. So the data is good, and an infographic is helpful that way, but the story is what moves people's hearts. Now, and I think the combination of those two, as far as funding for years. Now, the funding of the research is difficult, because my experience with funders and working with centers is the funders want to fund the activity, but they don't want to spend the money on the researcher, the personnel. And I get that, but we can't do the research without that.
Yeah, and the thing that just came to me, thank you, was that, what's the thing? So Prudence Fisher at Columbia, she always says to me, because I call her all the time, and I say, I want to do a research project, like a little one at home for this population. She's like, Jody, what do you want to measure? Yeah. And so for that, that's like, okay, so what's the story that the funders need to hear? Like, what's important to the funders? And how do I create my story around that? And part of my story, I love this infographic idea, is now I'm gonna give them a picture in addition to my passion. Right? Because my passion goes far, but not far enough to get a check.
And a funder usually has something that they are passionate about. Either they want people to integrate, or maybe have better families, or something along that. So you're looking. So then you're going to want to look for, is there any studies that have been published that are measuring family interaction, which there aren't. There's not a lot out there, but looking at that bigger picture, and that could be the data, but that's just the data to support the story.
Right, and it doesn't have to have horses in it.
No. Well, and it depends on what you're doing. As far as it may or may not have horses, it may be the environment that you're talking about. But if it's going to fund your program, it indirectly goes back to the horses. So I just think you have to have the right story for what they want. Find out what it is that they want to fund. I mean, that's what researchers do. We have to go to funding sources and find out what's hot and what's not, and you chase it. I mean, sometimes you have to chase it, and what's hot now is anything COVID related. Yeah. I've heard so many, RFPs like, yeah, we got another research. If you can hook it to COVID. Okay, effects of COVID. I've done enough effects of COVID. I'm living and breathing COVID. Not really, but like I'm university. But in public health, I mean, it's like, is it over yet? I don't know. But everything is right now is funded that way, and that happens every time. It goes federal initiatives change. It filters down to those things. For a while, veteran studies were hotter than they are now, and now they've kind of moved back. And that's what's difficult. I think.
So I have a question too about that. Like in New York State right now, they're really pushing the suicide prevention, and I know that I'm wondering how to approach UB, for instance, and ask them about getting involved because there is money available for the research. I just don't know how to approach them in terms of the academia approach. You know what I mean? Going from the veterans programs that we offer to a college to see if they would like to get involved with it.
Right, and so and mental health is actually getting a lot of publicity right now, which is really good. It needs it. I mean, we're so far behind in mental health. Don't even start about that. I could get my soapbox forever on that, because public health has not looked at mental health. COVID has revealed that, hey, we've got this issue called mental health. Suicide is huge. Suicide in marginalized groups is huge, and has been for some time, and with veterans. So if they are going to focus on suicide prevention, there's some money that could be had that way. That's the way I would approach it, because we know you can do the statistics of how many. It's still, I think it's still 1 in 22, or one.
But how would you approach the university? I mean, is there a specific, area to go to in terms of who would be the type of person? Obviously, probably in the psychology departments or social work or whatever. But is there a specific group in the colleges that deal with the research?
You look at the profiles. Look at the faculty profiles. When you go on to the departments of the faculty, where you're looking at psychology, public health, social work, sociology maybe as well, is you look at you pull up the faculty profiles, and when you pull up their profiles, you get their CVs. Typically they're online, and you can see what research. Sometimes the department will have, like our department website has latest research findings, and you'll start to see some of those things highlighted. And then that's how you find which faculty members are involved with that, and then you contact that faculty member. Say, I noticed from your website, or you're working on studies, this is what I do, are you interested? And it depends on what they have available. I get calls quite a bit and say, I saw this, and I'm like, I am full. I can't, until I get some other studies done, I can't take on no. But that's what you would do. Okay. Yeah, and find out who has an interest in that, who is getting ready. The other thing to do is to look for those that are at the assistant professor level. And the reason why I say that is because they are trying to tenure, and they are going to be motivated. They are going to be severely motivated to be working on it, and they're going to be cranking because they're 5 years. So I would look at the assistant professor level. Once you get to associate professor level, it means you've tenured. Full professor, you're there. You're probably doing buku amount of administrative work. And you're trying to keep your research going and everything else going. But that's what I would do. I look for assistant professors. You don't want to tap into, I mean, I was a lecturer for a while before I was tenure track and all that. But lecturers the research is typically not part of what they have to do. But that assistant professor will be a tenure track, and they're going to have to crank it out. So they're going to be motivated. Mm-hmm.
I was just going to say, just following up on that, my primary area of research is suicide and self-harm behavior. So if I have ideas for you,
great.
Thank you.
Yeah, if you can tap into that right now, that's actually really, you're probably finding funding a little bit easier maybe, unless it's COVID related.
No, there's definitely.
Yeah, I know in New York State, there was a big, suicide alliance with the state, and they have a
And
lot
I
of
have some
money.
really good colleagues in New York too, so.
Yeah, perfect, great, that's networking, there you go,
Perfect.
thank you so much.
You stress the importance of strong methodology. So is there an educational article that pertains particularly to equine-assisted services regarding strong methodological procedures?
Not that I'm aware of, but that would be really
Because
important.
then you could just post it up on websites and researchers could find it.
Yeah, that would be actually, because there's a lot of information on research design. There's books on research design. I've got like 5 of them in my office on all different kinds, and then there's people who specialize in those research designs. Some people are mixed methods. I'm a mixed method person. I love the mixed method. What that means is I have qualitative and quantitative. I get the numbers, but then I also do that qualitative analysis, which can be messy, but I like it because it gives the depth to the numbers. Other people that don't do that, they're only quantitative. Other people that are purely qualitative, and then you have all the research design specialists involved in that as well. So in the literature, you can do a lot of research design, but I think the research design, there's not an article or information about which ones are I'm not sure there's the strongest one, but there's different ones that have different strengths that might be more related to equine-assisted services.
Maybe a particular design would be better for a particular population.
And that could be too as well, yes. Because, I think that things like that, especially with the veterans, having a randomized controlled trial with the veterans becomes difficult. I learned this because they didn't want to randomize. There was they told me, my buddy's not starting, I'm not starting. It's like, okay, I forgot about that, it's very important. And because of the issues that we've had with the VA, and I wish that wasn't the barrier, but there's a barrier there. So while it might be easier for others to have more randomized abilities, it may be more difficult, like you said, for certain populations. So that's an excellent idea.
If you're interested too, HHRF just did a free webinar that's available on YouTube, and it has different research designs and how they pertain to equine-assisted services.
And building on that, the Education Committee is in fact planning exactly what you just talked about. A series of information that would be available on the website to address the strengths and weaknesses of the different kinds and how it relates to the equine environment as such. So stay tuned is all I can say. Stay tuned to HHRF.
So I would really suggest too, making sure that, I'm sure you guys are doing this, making sure you're tapping into people who that's their specialty. Because researchers don't have specialty across all different kinds of design. We have a basic working knowledge, but we have ones that we gravitate to and we have more experience with. And so I think that's something also to make sure that it's like we can't be a jack of all trades. And so we tend to specialize. So having, like right now, one of our studies that we were doing, I needed to step out and say, okay, who does more of the case control studies and the case series studies, who's in my faculty that can lead to, I know a little bit about it, I've done it, but that's not my expertise in research design. So we would tap into somebody in our faculty that has that research design or outside of our faculty. So that's really important to tap into people who that's their specialty area. Because they actually specialize in certain research designs. So that's real helpful. I'm glad that they're doing, I think that's so critical. So glad that there's a webinar already and maybe something in the works. So wonderful.
Really quickly, Pebbles just wanted me to announce that we're heading into the theater for the last thing, and there's gonna be like a group picture, so before the panel. And also, if you didn't pick up your certificates, they're on the tables where lunch was served yesterday.
Thank you.